Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Constantinopolitans and cosmopolitans, welcome to another episode of Clarifying Catholicism. You're watching part 4 of a series on the history of the Ecumenical Councils according to the Catholic Church. Today we are covering the First Council of Constantinople. Much of this information was gathered from Joseph Kelly's The Ecumenical Councils of the Catholic Church, a History. So if you want an in-depth dive into these topics, be sure to pick up a copy of this great book. To see the rest of our episodes, check out the playlist in our description. Without further ado, on to the show. Last episode, we explored how the First Council of Constantinople determined that Jesus Christ was equitable with God, yet distinct from him. While most of the Council Fathers at Nicaea were content with this resolution, many were not. The prospect of Jesus Christ being God, but also man, raises more questions than answers. Plus, even though the language discrepancies between Greek-speaking Christians and Latin-speaking Christians had been carefully worked out at the Council itself, many of their priests and theologians back home were just confused by the new terminology that their representatives had agreed on. Specifically, the term homoousios, the term used to describe Jesus and God as of the same substance, came under a lot of fire from conservative theologians in the East who believed the term, which is thought to have been proposed by a Western Latin-speaking representative, overemphasized Christ's similarity with God and did not distinguish him enough. Basically, they saw it as a massive concession to Western theology, a theme that will also pop up throughout this series. So many Eastern bishops began reneging on their agreements from the Council. Some even excommunicated high-profile pro-Nicene theologians like Athanasius of Alexandria. Constantinople even agreed to take Arius back into the church, but the day he came into the city, he died of an intestinal disease in a public toilet. The pro-Nicene theologians, of course, interpreted this as a rather gross sign from God. In 336, the Emperor Constantine died, leaving the empire in the hands of his 3 sons. As any historian can tell you, an extremely powerful ruler dividing his kingdom among several competitors is kind of like throwing a steak to 3 starving dogs. They're probably going to tear it up. Constantine had 3 sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantinius II. So Constantine II didn't last very long. He was executed by Constans. Constans, who was a pro-Nicene Christian, took the western part of the empire, while Constantinius II, who took over the east. Obviously, this exacerbated tensions between pro- and anti-Nicene bishops. The exiled Alexandrian theologian, Athanasius, was instrumental in helping the western pro-Nicene side win over support from the anti-Nicene east, but political problems inhibited his success. But what sort of event can bring a hyper-partisan nation together better than anything else? War. In 369, the eastern half of the empire faced a barbarian invasion, so the focus was shifted on that for a bit. Taking advantage of this lull in theological conflict, Athanasius moved to not only reaffirm the Nicene stance that the Father and Son were equals, but he went a step further to claim that the Holy Spirit was also equal with them. Yeah, you may have noticed in my last video the suspicious absence of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's because its relationship to the Father and the Son was still hotly contested by many bishops. Athanasius was a rather controversial figure, but he was supported by 3 major theologians: Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory the Nazianzen. Remember that the biggest difference between East and West was largely linguistic. The word homoousia, or of the same substance, that Nicaea used to describe the relationship between the Father and the Son, had been criticized by the East for making the Father and the Son too similar and not distinct enough. Basil and the 2 Gregorys helped to smooth over a lot of these differences by explaining them. Their work was well received, but the 2 emperors at the time, who were both pro-Nicene, wanted to go a step further to ensure that the Arian controversy would never arise again. So they called for a council at Constantinople in 381. This council basically reaffirmed the Eastern and Western commitment to the Council of Nicaea. It did not include any significant Western representation, probably because most of the controversies involved Eastern dioceses. The Bishop of Antioch presided over the council, but he died, so the emperor appointed Gregory of Nazianzus, who by this point was the Bishop of Constantinople, to lead it. Given Gregory's role in developing Trinitarian theology, this choice initially made sense. However, as you may recall from the last episode, many of the bishops from the other major dioceses resented Constantinople. Gregory wanted nothing to do with this drama, so he resigned. By this point, the Eastern Emperor, Theodosius I, was so exacerbated by this drama that he made one of his imperial officials preside over the council. This official wasn't even Christian, so the bishops quickly baptized and ordained him a bishop. Constantinople I is not only significant for reaffirming what Nicaea said, but for elevating the Holy Spirit to the status of the Father and the Son. This, of course, drew criticism from some conservative bishops who accused the council of innovation. Nevertheless, the creed that was drawn up at this council is very similar to what Christians today call the Nicene Creed, so it would be accurate to say that while the Nicene Creed uses ideas from Nicaea, its more complete form actually comes from the Council of Constantinople. As I mentioned last episode, one council's solution is another council's problem, and this one was certainly no exception. There was another canon that was passed that greatly upset many major apostolic dioceses. The council's third canon reads, "The Bishop of Constantinople shall have primacy of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is the new Rome." Now, if there were any innovations at this council, this was it. Up until this point, the most respected dioceses in all the empire descended from apostolic foundations. This was the first time a diocese had ever claimed to derive its authority from simply being a political power, and it would have massive ramifications down the line. On the other hand, it is also notable that this canon mentions Rome's diocese as having the most amount of honor. At some point, I'll host another series on the history of Rome's leadership of the Church, but this canon is cited as an important acknowledgement of Rome's early authority. Nevertheless, by the end of the 4th century, most bishops agreed with the Council's Christological decisions. As we will see in our next episode, though, the Church's commitment to the divinity of Christ only raised more questions than answers. See you next time.